In India, over 200 people were killed by extreme heat this year. Thailand's government issued a warning about severe monsoon conditions affecting the whole of the country. The US, especially its southwestern part, has been grappling with record-breaking temperatures. Not to mention here in Beijing, summer arrived early, coupled with unexpected turbulent weather conditions. Is 2024 going to set another record, as the World Meteorological Organization proclaimed last year to be the hottest on record? Extreme weather events could impose a staggering cost on society and the environment. Besides the various efforts to mitigate global warming, what else needs to be done? How can cash-strapped African countries adapt to climate change for which they were not primarily responsible? Is China, as an important creditor to some of these countries, part of the conversation? I sat down with an exclusive interview in Beijing with Professor Patrick Vercoyen, Chief Executive Officer at the Global Center on Adaptation, an international organization dedicated to climate change adaptation. Welcome, Professor Vercoyen, to The Point. First of all, help us understand what exactly is adaptation and why is it so important?
Yeah, well, adaptation is actually, it's about people. We're living in the climate breakdown. We see more storms, more floods, more droughts across the globe here in China, but also in Africa, in Europe and America. And the question is, how are we coping with this climate emergency? So it is about doing agriculture differently. It's about building our infrastructure differently. It is about people inherently, how they develop. And our proposition is we need to develop this through a climate lens. It doesn't make sense to build a road which will be washed away the following day. It doesn't make sense to do agriculture when the water is not sufficient. So we need to do our lives differently. And we now need to think about not only of the weather and the climate of today, but also where we're heading tomorrow. So we need to have this foresight on how we achieve our goals in life. And climate is a very important phenomenon which dictates whether we'll succeed and thrive or whether we fail in life. So in that sense, adaptation is adapting to the reality around us. We as mankind have been doing that from the beginning, but now the climate emergency is accelerating the need to adapt to weather circumstances around us.
Well, if you look at where we are, for instance, Beijing, what are some of the things you can point to as examples of adaptation adequate or not adequate at the moment?
So here in Beijing or in China or in Africa or in Europe or in America, I mean, there's lots of sort of efforts to adapt to a changing climate. Whether it's, let's say, in a city like Beijing, where different green parks are being initiated because, of course, it reduces the heat stress. It is about infrastructure, so when the rains are coming in a much more high quantity in a shorter time, how do we absorb the water? I think these types of interventions are taking place, but the problem is it's not at the scale which is required, and it's certainly not at the speed which is required. And that's exactly what you see in Africa. Africa, as you know, is one of the most vulnerable continents in the world to the climate crisis. In fact, 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable nations in the world to climate change are in Africa. And the irony is that Africa did not cause the climate crisis. In fact, less than 4% of global greenhouse emissions come from Africa, but Africa is experiencing the impacts. Africa, as you know, is very much focused on agriculture. Well, if the droughts are there, if the rains are there, if the floods are there, agriculture is being impacted. So Africa needs to adjust, but quite frankly, it doesn't have the resources at the right volume, so to say.
So in terms of resources, in terms of adequacy or inadequacy, are there some numbers you can point to, for instance, what has been done, what is, for now, the good news, but what is the bad news?
Yeah, the good, the bad and the ugly, so to say. So for example, for Africa is this: how much does Africa need to adapt to climate change? So different agriculture, different infrastructure, different ways of, let's say, climate finance flowing. On an annual basis, is $100 billion a year. How much is currently flowing to Africa from the global north is $10 billion a year. So you see this sort of
1/10.
a tenth which is currently put on the table. And the sad reality is this: the world, through the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement in 2015, promised to adapt to the changing climate by doubling adaptation finance to the global south. Up to this date, that promise has not been delivered. It is expected to be, it is not expected, it's committed to be delivered in 2025. But I mean, now it's all to play for. And what many sort of rich nations indicate, they say, well, we're living in an inflation crisis, in a food crisis. There's a war in Ukraine. There's a war in Palestine. We don't have the fiscal space to invest in climate adaptation. But if you live in Kenya, or if you live in China, or you live in Bangladesh, or in Barbados, you're experiencing these impacts today. There's some sort of resources available from governments themselves, such as in Bangladesh, or in Kenya, or in Barbados. But obviously, the international community has to step up in terms of global solidarity.
Well, one of the things you advocated is for creditors to pause their debts for African countries. You've been writing about that. Has there been any reaction? Has there been any discussion even on how, doing exactly that?
Yeah, so this pausing of debt when natural disasters strike is one of the key fundamentals which Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados put on the table. She said, well, we as a small island developing nation, we cannot afford that when a cyclone or a hurricane strikes, let's say, our small island development states, to build back. Well, at the same time, our government resources are very limited, and at the same time also pay back our creditors. So she said, we need in the international financial architecture, we need a clause, which is basically a pause button when a natural disaster strikes, that these creditors need to wait for a short while.
What has been the response?
And the response, quite frankly, is positive. There is this so-called Bridgetown initiative. Bridgetown is the capital of Barbados, and Bridgetown became this icon of the reform of the international financial architecture. So there are now very active conversations on their way, where international institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF or the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank say, hey, listen, we understand the realities on the ground when natural disaster strikes, so let's talk about how we can then pause the payback of the loans at that particular moment in time. And I think that's a very healthy conversation to have, but that now needs to be concluded so that when the next hurricane season comes in the Caribbean, which is this July and August, indeed that natural disaster clause kicks in.
Are you happy with the kind of speed of reaction or the speed of changes people are taking in order to adapt adequately to climate change?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not necessarily a pessimist that we're not going fast enough. I'm definitely not an optimist. I'm not naive, but I'm very determined to accelerate speed and scale on adaptation. And one example is this. Together with the African Development Bank and the African Union, we as Global Center on Adaptation have put on the table the largest adaptation program in the world for Africa, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's $25 billion over 5 years. Currently $9 billion in the last 2 years have already been invested. The good thing is, so you can see on the ground that this is working, and it is not just a moral case that we have to invest because Africa is suffering, although we do. It's an economic case, because it's interesting. Every dollar, euro, pound you invest in climate adaptation, be it in agriculture, be it in infrastructure, has a much higher return on that particular dollar, pound or euro. So it makes economic sense to do so. If you talk to a minister of finance and you talk about the economics of climate adaptation, it's very compelling. But now what is required at a scale which is not just in the millions or in the billions. We need a shift of the trillions of our global financial system to unlock the resources required for this agenda.
Well, you are working very closely with China, and you talk about China's global leadership being absolutely critical to the success in climate adaptation globally. What exactly do you mean, and what has China been? How has China been responding to the calls to step up adaptation?
Yeah, I think President Xi Jinping's leadership in a run-up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, together at that time with President Obama, was vital. Otherwise, there was no Paris Agreement in the first place. One. Secondly, in the Paris Agreement, there is a clause that the world will step up on lowering our carbon footprint. Good, but we're not on track. There was also a clause that we would increase our financing. Good, but we're not on track. But the third clause is that the world would also adapt to this changing reality. And what China has been doing in the last few years is actually quite inspiring. It put on the table its own national adaptation strategy for 2035, and we as Global Center on Adaptation were very privileged to work with China on this. The good thing about that is that the country of China, the size of China, the political influence China has, it demonstrates what can be done, not just in China, but there's also inspiration for the rest of the world that the lessons from China will be translated to other parts of the world. And
can you point to one example, for instance, one of the things that China did in adaptation?
One example is very important, say, for Africa. China is very advanced in the agriculture sector. China is, in particularly in innovation, right? I mean, it's the best and the brightest minds are here in China on agriculture. If you live in Africa, and if you live in a small village and you know that the droughts are not coming, what do you need? You need drought-tolerant seeds, that it grows also when the water is not there. Those types of innovations are not just only coming from the West, but are certainly also coming from China. So this South-South collaboration is a very strong feature of Chinese sort of global leadership, particularly on adaptation. So I think that is very important, but also there more can be done. It's not just China and the global South. Where is the global North in terms of financing? Where is the global North in terms of sharing best practices? It's a global coordinated effort which is required now because we're in the eye of the storm of the climate emergency, all hands on deck.
How come do you think China is able to play this role? I see as a bridge, between the more advanced technologies of the developed countries to the global South. How come you think China is able to do that? I'm seeing it as, for me, this is common sense. When the climate is getting drier, for thousands of years, we've been trying to adapt to the changing climate.
Exactly. So it's common sense, and it is also enlightened self-interest. I think China's vision on this agenda is, China is already experiencing the impacts of climate change on its own economy. From some account, it's from 0.5% to 2% of GDP on an annual basis it's losing. So if you think about it, if you lose, let's say 2% of GDP on an annual basis, but if you were to invest, let's say a fraction of that 2% to address these impacts, it makes indeed, it's commonsensical, and hence it makes economic sense. So that's the vision of China. It makes economic sense to invest in this agenda. And the good thing is, when China comes behind an agenda such as this, because of enlightened self-interest, it goes so with a particular scale and speed and rigor. And I think that scale, speed and rigor is what is a really inspirational force for the rest of the world to follow.
My last question, well, China is an important debtor, is an important creditor for a lot of projects in Africa, in the global South. And people would ask the question, if you're asking for a pause when extreme climate strikes, what is China doing? Has China been doing something to help?
So the conversations between African leaders, whether it being it President Ruto of Kenya or President Akufo-Addo of Ghana, is with all the creditors, right? The bilateral creditors, the commercial creditors, the international finance institutions, including with China, obviously. So these conversations are currently underway. They're obviously quite complicated because pausing payment back to sort of certain loans, how long, under what conditions, when are you ready to pay back? These are quite technical conversations at the same time. But I think the position of China is that it makes sense to pause to pay back, provided you reinvest these resources in a resilient economy in Africa, because a resilient Africa is in the interest of China,
Sure.
and a resilient China is in the interest of Africa.
Has China started doing that?
So these conversations are currently very live. I think this conversation which we're having today is also, let's say, very timely, because these conversations are happening as we speak. And I think the signals which we see, let's say, coming out of these dialogues are very promising. So I hope for a very fruitful conclusion of that.
Thank you very much. We're going to leave it there. Professor Patrick Verkooyen, Chief Executive Officer of Global Center for Adaptation.
My pleasure.
My exclusive with Professor Patrick Verkooyen, Chief Executive Officer at Global Center on Adaptation. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.